Hi, my name is Benedict. This is going to be the second in the series of articles walking through building, working with particular categories of sound. Obviously of some very direct interest if you're a synthesist or just using synthesizers, because the two don't necessarily be the same thing. A synthesist being somebody who makes sounds, who specializes in making sounds. Somebody who uses synthesizers is merely a person who uses synthesizers, like a guy who builds guitars is not a guitarist per se. He may be, but there can be a distinction. You may think, why make the distinction? Well, it helps you to understand where your role is. If you use synthesizers, mostly presets maybe tweak a little bit, then you're predominantly a synth player. If you are building your sounds completely from scratch, then you are a synthesist as well. There's no reason why you can't be anywhere on that sliding scale. It's not about exclusivism or anything like that. Something else you may notice is that I seem to have a slightly different camera angle for every single time. I'm working with very simple gear. I'm not here to give you magnificent Spielberg productions. That's not the point. You're here, hopefully, to understand my brain. This is about the thinking. So if you're put off by the living clutter in the back here, because this is the garage, then this may not be for you. You're here, hopefully, to understand what I've got in my brain to help take that into your brain. This position, while not as pretty as the last one, puts the mic closer to my speaking parts, which should help improve the sound slightly. Alright, the usual housekeeping here. I've got an echo unit. It is purely there just to make everything that little bit easier to listen to. That's it. Otherwise there is a thing to turn up the overall volume of the sound, just to keep that balance a little easier, and a limiter to make sure that nothing goes too awry. So, what we're going to look at this time are just what we could call generally polyphonic sounds. These are sounds that are probably going to be played in a polyphonic mode. A whole collection of notes, rather than a monophonic lead line, which is likely to be one at a time. There are plenty of sounds, like a piano is a polyphonic instrument, but you may use it monophonically in your mix. A violin technically is a polyphonic instrument in that it can play, I believe, 2 notes at once, but it's largely used as a monophonic instrument. I know it's very tempting to get your synth or string samples and go, but it's not how it actually works, and we'll talk about that in another section, perhaps where I talk about strings and things like that in particular. So polyphonic sounds in general, again, really broad category, so that can cover piano sounds, guitar sounds. And when I say pianos and guitars, I don't mean pianos and guitars. We're not talking samples here. What you learn here you can apply to samples, but this is really about the mindset of those sounds. It can also go off into just pure synthy sounds. But we'll look across a few of the sorts of things that you're going to encounter and why. Now, why, of course, is the very first thing that we always should be asking ourselves. Why am I using this sound? Why is it in the mix? What role does it play in the story of my piece? If you're thinking, oh, but Benedict, I don't have a story for my piece, then stop writing right now. Stop your piece, but until you've got a sense of a story. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a woke up in the morning, the sun was shining, I got out of bed, I combed my hair, I went downstairs and went into a dream. Hang on, I think the Beatles did that already, didn't they? Stealing! Story is a sense of this is about something. Now, even if you are writing pure dance floor filler, there's still a story there. What's the story? You're setting a scene, you're wanting a reaction. So always have a sense of what the story, or narrative, if we were thinking more high art terms, they're the same thing. What is that? So what's this going to achieve? So, sounds bloody awful. Does it fulfill the story of your piece? If it does fulfill it, probably not. You're going to frighten the kiddies off. If it's a horror movie, however, winning. So it's all about the story, the relevance. So we start with a basic synthesizer, which does sound like that, pretty ghastly. It's then about creating the shapes that define what your sound needs to do. Hear how that decays. So obviously a lot of polyphonic sounds like guitars and pianos and things like that, they don't stay there all the time. They're often more in the role of pad sounds. But it varies tremendously. And then you've got to look at the tone. Obviously that's a really aggressive, very hard to deal with tone. So we start introducing filters. Hey presto, we've got a piano sound. Okay, maybe you don't want to play Chopin on that sound, but that's not the point of this. The point is understanding that we will probably not want this sound to hang around forever. The other thing with most sounds is that they move over time. You're listening to me speak, and your ability to understand the words comes from my mouth moving the sound over time. Only I'm doing that so much faster, so it becomes what you think of as speech. You might think, thanks Captain Obvious, why are you telling me this crap? Your instrument needs to do the same. Now at the moment, perfectly playable, I could use that in a piece exactly as it sits. However, after a little while of we start to feel that sounds maybe just a wee bit flat. So we can start to introduce some things that instruments might do, which there is a case of we're using an envelope to make that sound decay over time. We'll just get rid of that for the moment. Now we're not doing that because that's what pianos do. Pianos do that because they're useful then musically. So it puts the emphasis on the front of the note, like we're front loading that sound. Just like a drum sound, we compress it to front load it. Not to make it louder or softer, but to front load it. In other words, what we're saying is we want the click on the front to pull it through the mix, and then you've got the tail of it which gives you extra information. If you ever listen to rockabilly, good rockabilly, you'll notice they don't use a kick drum at all. Because the bass player, the slap bass player, he's actually banging those strings onto the instrument, and the instrument's got this great big body on it, in which case he provides the drum as well. So the kick drum's actually handled by the bass player, and you hear that click, that bang as the strings go down. If you don't find some real rockabilly, it'll normally be a trio of guys. You'll have a stand-up drummer, sometimes with kick drum, but often without. You'll just have a snare and maybe a cymbal, that's it. You'll have a guitarist who's often the singer, sometimes a bass player is the singer, but you'll have this stand-up bass player and that's providing the kick. Now the whole point of that digression is that this is what we're doing here. So it can play in the bass. Now one of the most memorable instruments in rock for this is actually the clavinet, Stevie Wonder. Go track down some Stevie Wonder, like Superstition. Master Blaster, anything like that, is clavinet playing. Really percussive. So it's still a polyphonic sound, but that cuts straight through the mix. It's easy to think of those sounds often as guitars. Plenty of people thought, oh, what a funky guitar player. Nope. That's Stevie Wonder or somebody in the band playing a clavinet. It's a polyphonic sound, so you can use them tremendously versatile. So here we're having the brightness of that sound decay over time. It can be quite subtle. We can then assign that to velocity. Let's overplay that. Very common effect in a lot of the DX7 pianos. Commonly synths aren't quite, like a simple envelope is often not quite what we're looking for, because that's sound goes up, sound tails off. These are a pretty linear envelope. It depends on the shape of your envelopes. Don't fuss too much on that. There are a couple of ways we can do it. We can look at having a sloped envelope, so in other words it decays really fast and then it sort of evens out over time. Or if we've got more envelopes, we can just do what we've got here. See, we can start to add a little bit of pick to that sound. Not too much. Again, depends on what you want the sound to be like. That's a piano sound. May not be the loveliest. It's probably a bit lovelier. Remember, I hear everything a bit wrong in these cans. I wouldn't do that. This kind of work in headphones, because I know that it always turns out wrong. Take care, as I spoke about last time, with using resonance in general polyphonic sounds. If they're meant to be super synthy, go for it. But if they're meant to sit in the middle of the mix and build a mix and use a lot of resonance, then you're going to have distraction everywhere. It's like whizzes and everywhere. It's going to sound more like a busy arcade game, like Raiden or something. But a little bit can just load a bit of that, which reminds me, you like to see this. And let's put that on the master. See how we're increasing the power of those partials. We're basically EQing them up a little bit. We could achieve the same thing by getting our good selves an EQ, an awful lot like this one. Hear how that's now got a toppier sound. Up here, so you might decide you want to add a little bit of high frequency. We might decide we don't want some of. Like, let's say we don't want all of that there. Often you don't. Often in a polyphonic sound, you've got your bass handling the bass. So what's the point of having another instrument playing a lot of stuff that sounds great when it's soloed, but is bollocks in the total mix because you've made mush. It's pretty ticky. So we might choose to be a little smoother on this. Soloed, you might think, oh, it's a little weedy, but we get that in the right situation, in the right mix. That's going to sound super cool. If you're in a position to ever pull apart a really great 70s record, there's a fair chance you'll find the electric piano sound is not a million miles from that. Now the other thing, we talked about this with bass, it's definitely an issue with polyphonic sounds, is saturation. We'll turn off the EQ for now, we'll turn that off for now too. Saturation. Remember, this is just a kind of wave shaping which is designed to add distortion. Lovely. The idea with saturation is that we keep it so low we're not hearing it as distorted. So depending upon the performance, I tend to play soft, so I can have quite a lot, and that's going to add a little bit more complexity up here. Not a good thing, not a bad thing, it's to taste. So don't just automatically go, oh, you have to put a saturation unit on to make something sound good. You can make it sound terrible with a saturation unit. All of these sounds come to taste. So there's no right, there's no wrong. But a lot of EQ based on the track. The story of the track, the story this instrument's telling in the track is often necessary and goes a long way to changing or redefining your instrument. That's where the real mixing magic comes, is in defining your instrument. And as a synthesist, you're always defining an instrument. That may sound piano-y, but we're defining an instrument. Change that to, say, pulse width. Whilst I think of it in terms of octaves, with a bass sound, you're probably going to go -1 octave. Some synths default to being -1 octave, as in that's the default situation. Sounds brilliant, sounds brutal, but when you go to play your piano lines, you're going to wonder why they sound like shit. Turn it back up. You need separation. Bass lives in the bass. That's down here. Your mid-range stuff lives in the mid-range. Try not to have them do the same thing. Remember, if this is what your piano line's doing, whilst you've got a bass that's doing, you're just going to make mud. No one can mix that. It's not about being a shit mixer or not having the right plugins. It's just about poor composition and poor arrangement. Really poor composition. It's just like, why would we put everything down here? So allow each instrument to define the area that they use, and that's often where your EQ is really useful, because like if we were looking at this, the Thor, let's turn our EQ on, and we know that we've got bass running around down there, and that we want this to be strongest, say here. We've now got a better situation. We can of course also use filters. Hear how even though you think, oh, but you just ripped the bottom off that, it's still there. We've got a couple of you're still clearly identifying that as a bass sound. It's a sound in the bass register. But it pulls through very clearly, even though we've hacked a lot of it off. Same up here. A lot of your polyphonic sounds in a mix are in the middle of the mix. So you don't want them necessarily doing too much up top. Sorry, Sati, I kind of stole some of your Gymnopedies. But we can use our peak to decide where we want to push that instrument through. Where's his home? You do that with all instruments, but a lot of people make the mistake in the middle of either saying, I'll put that too low, because they've soloed it, and so you've got this kind of sound. Until you put it in the mix, and it's unworkable. If you need more welly on this sound, like you want to emphasize that, remember that's the trick I taught you last time with your bass? We're picking an octave or so above, so you've got your fundamental there. You've got your overtone series. If you pick the next one, or even the one after, gives it a lot of pull through. So what we've actually achieved is warmth. A lot of times when people are adding bass, they're actually wanting to add warmth, but they don't understand that. So they go, oh, well, I'll add a shit ton of bass. Oh yeah, that's warm. But it's unusable. It's not warm, it's just mud. If it's the only instrument in your mix, by all means. But even there, you hear how it's troublesome already. So you're better off to do that sort of thing. Again, comes down to every situation. There, I'd probably be wanting to be removing some of those mids, maybe about here, because I'm playing chords in the lows, which is going to mush it up. But my piece is not actually about those low chords. They provide the background, the environment in which is the real story. So we shouldn't let that be the whole piece. No matter how funky we think it is on its own, without this, it's kind of irrelevant. Otherwise it's like taking a photograph of an empty sporting stadium and saying, what a great game we're having. You've missed the actual game. What about taking a photo of the game and the cheerleaders and people eating hot dogs and cheerleaders? Keep on message, which oddly enough is never as much about cheerleaders as you want it to be. Let's turn our EQ off and get these out of the way. Very tempting to create really huge sounds with your polyphonic sounds. Ooh, let's put that in. That sounds magnificent. You'll do more damage than good more often than not. Again, you can do it. I'm not saying don't do it. But we're adding. So where we play polyphonically, we're not only playing these notes, but we're playing that whole spread an octave down. So when I'm playing this, I'm actually playing that at the same time. So if I turn off my sub-oscillator, is actually would that be a sensible thing to write? More often than not, no. In lead sounds it can be very cool. You can have lead sounds with that lower octave. Very different feel. But in a polyphonic sound, please take extreme care. I know a lot of you will probably be thinking, oh, but Benedict, you don't know anything about Plucks. I know a lot of you want to hear about Plucks. The reason that those immense sounds are used so much and so heavily relied upon is because they actually allow you to be lazy. Look how much of the frequency range, whoop, I'll point with my pointing stick, you've actually taken up with this sound. It's okay if you've got nothing else musical going on, but as soon as you've got other musical things going on, you're screwed. If you've made your drum sounds so huge, they take up the whole room. If you've made your bass sound so huge it takes up the whole room, especially if you're using one of those. That's not to say that isn't just a damn magnificent sound. But you've taken up a massive amount of the frequency range, leaving not much else to go in there. So if you have that bass sound, the chorus, and then you're... It's okay whilst they're playing parallel, like that. That's monophonic. It's like medieval composing. It works as long as I stay to chord notes and play only a single note up the top. But that would have sounded fine on the electric piano. It's troublesome now. So please just take care. If you start with an immense sound, it can have its purpose. We need to change our playing style to suit that instrument. So. Is it possible? I'm not good in that space, but change your playing style or find the instrument that suits your playing style. It's one or the other. If you try and do in between and say, oh, I'm going to play a beautiful electric piano line on that, you're screwed. You really are. If we get rid of those, you're still kind of screwed. As we reduce the number of instances, the thickness of that sound, hear how we've reduced the thickness of that sound. All we've changed there is the wave input. And now it's clear enough for us to hear the story being told. So while it's tempting to layer up an immense amount of stuff, that actually works better than I thought it would. probably in part because we've got the octave reduced. Yeah, turn the octave back up, starts to kludge. Because that's high, it becomes a thinner sound automatically, and we've turned quite a bit of it off, so let's get rid of that. Not for such a complex line, but if I was making patches, I'd probably save that off. It's kind of cool, especially if we give it a little bit of... So I'd use that in a mix, but as you see, if I'm playing lower chords and upper, it becomes problematic. So again, repeating myself, but I think it's pretty necessary, because I hear mixes so often where people haven't thought about the instrument that they're applying or the playing style they're applying. They've just gone, that's what I want, jam the two together. I wonder why it hasn't really come out right. So the more complex your musical line, often the easier it is to get away with using a simple sound, because remember, at that point the emphasis is on your musical line, the story you're telling. So if you started by telling, I don't know, a classic fairy tale, and if you started it by yelling it into a microphone like a rapper, with that microphone going through an overdrive, and then into massive amounts of delays and phases and flanges and octave pedals, to who's going to stay with you? Nobody. Because the story is now destroyed. Like, you're not telling it the way that it needs to be told. Whereas if you sat down with a nice narrator or male, female, whatever, and they were getting into the story and telling the feeling of the story. You know, and the poor huntsman and his wife discussed how they couldn't afford to keep their children, so they're going to take them out into the woods and find the right thing for the story. So find the right sound. Don't just go, I like that sound. Or if you do like that sound, then tell a different story, or choose how you retell your story. So if we really liked that all-in sound with everything here, and still like that, then we might say, let's take the information off this left hand and put it to another instrument that's not going to have so many issues. That can work. Or you might even say, let's take the bottom two notes off this polyphonic chord and just play the top notes, because they're the ones that give the flavour to that chord. Or just play the bottom notes. Obviously you've got to choose because you're the musician, but you could make that a monophonic sound. With the rest of that chordal stuff split up into 2 or maybe 3 other instruments. You might say, I'm going to take the bottom note, hand it to the bass player. The middle notes, hand them to the guitarist. The bottom couple of notes from that chord to another guitarist. And then on its own doesn't sound like much, but once you've got all of that happening at once, you've got a great arrangement. So polyphonic sounds, there can be this kind of stuff. Let's just put them all sort of in the... But we're also getting into pad territory. So if that's your lead, great, that's fine. Which brings me to my very favourite type of sounds, which are brass sounds. Kind of a weird one, we'll stop that. Kind of a kooky brass sound, but it isn't. Similar playing, completely different sound, completely different feel. So you're looking at, well, what am I putting into the beginning of this to what am I getting at the end of it? Really learn to establish that relationship. Is this a better sound? It's a fatter sound. But is it a better sound? No, there is no answer to that. Same with this, is this a better sound? Depends what your story is. If we're following one guy, walking down a lonely path, brilliant, that's the right sound. If we're being grand, all the noble peasants have come to kill the ignoble king, then we're going to go with a bigger sound. Brass sounds are made primarily from how the filter behaves. In brass, the dude starts playing and it takes a little while for the tin to start vibrating enough to give you that really cool brassy sound. So that's your classic brass sound. And that all depends on what role you want it to play. And again, if we want it to sound synthy, hold down lots of chords. If we want it to sound organic or orchestral, you don't even need to swap across two samples. You just need to understand your instrument and how they're played. If we were playing that in the brass section, do brass players, you know, the guys with the big tin tubes, do they play a chord? No, because their instruments are all monophonic. So you may say, what's this doing in the polyphonic section? Exactly, what's it doing in the polyphonic section? What are you doing playing it polyphonically? But in what you hear, they become a polyphonic sound, because one guy plays this, another guy plays this, third guy plays this. There may be even 10 guys playing this, 10 more playing this, 10 more playing this. What you hear sounds like that, but actually isn't. Because you've got either 1 or 10 instruments playing this, you've got a slightly different set of instruments playing this, slightly different set of instruments playing that. So when you hear that from an orchestra, it actually sounds so much better, because you're not actually hearing that chord played as a chord, you're hearing that chord created out of a whole lot of instruments. So if you want to do the orchestral thing, whether you're using samples or synthesis, don't be lazy. Don't just whack down chords and go, why does it sound synthy? Actually work out what your chords are. Who would likely be playing this? What instruments are likely managing this? Now the thing is, you don't even have to be technically accurate. You can say, bugger that, I've got my instruments, I'm going to play it my way. But break it up. Who's playing what lines? And are they sitting close together or are they out? Is the lower one the French horns, trumpets, piccolos? Probably not, but the different trumpet section. You could be trombones, French horns, trumpets. You can do whatever you want, and they would be standing separately. So you end up with that immense sound because you're using many different instruments. It's layering, what in synthesis terms we call layering, just like me going. That's a fundamental form of layering, simple one, but if we were to layer several synth sounds, separate synth sounds, that played in the same sphere, and played them all at once, that's layering. Guess what? That's an orchestra. An orchestra is just a great big mofo of a layering synthesizer. Here's another trick. Now remember, we need to add extra movement into our sounds to make them realistic. At the moment that's moving oscillator detune amount. Okay, that's not a bad thing for us to be playing with. Hear the difference here. Now we've just got the one oscillator. Kind of not as brassy. So the reason that sounds worked out of the gate is because we already had this programmed. Doesn't matter how much I try and fatten it up, it never quite sounds right. So what we're doing here is we're using our modulation envelope here to do this on the beginning of each note. And you know why? Because when you start playing a tube, the first thing you've got to do is fill it up. In which case, a lot of times, tube-based instruments, brass, you blow into them. Which means, obviously, I'm not a good brass player, especially with that terrible technique. But there's a little bit of that. So what happens is your instrument tends to go sharp. The other thing that tends to happen is this. We'll take an oscillator, we'll send it to pitch. Sorry, an LFO, we'll send it to pitch. We'll run it pretty fast. Stylish. We will now control that with our modulation envelope. We'll turn this down for the moment so it's not doing anything. You recognize that sound? We're actually hearing what's happening in the front end. That's what a great synthesis does. They understand what's happening there, and then they go, not necessarily how can I photocopy that, but how can I create something that gives that feel? So I may decide to assign that to, let's say, velocity. So the harder he plays, the more he overblows. Obviously that's too much. So understand where you want to go with that sound, where it needs to go. Sounds synthy. Yeah, it's a synth, but it now starts to sound organic. So there's no right or wrong there. If you want to sound synthy, if you want to do the whole let's pretend to be John Carpenter thing, make Stranger Things, then whack down chords on everything. If you want to have a more organic feel, consider breaking out your instruments out of your chords. You might decide, okay, I'm going to sit down and write the whole thing in chords on a piano, put those chords in and then break them up. Plenty of composers do it that way. It's up to you how you do it. So that's basically how you might make a brass sound. A lot of the other sounds that you make will either be just straight synth sounds. Weirdo synth sound. Could serve a purpose in a mix. Probably low down in the mix doing some weird thing, but it serves its purpose. Normally we would be doing this the other way around. Let's apply the filter envelope. Pretty useless sound, so we'll get rid of those for now. Let's look at a guitar type sound. We're going to want to take our LFO, apply it to pitch. Because what do guitarists do? They tend to pluck a string and then often vibrato that string. The other thing they tend to do is to bend a string. Poor strings take quite a beating, which is why you often want to actually change them once in a while. We could do this with the pitch bend. Don't love it that way. If we look at aftertouch, let's overdo that to start with. Weird. Oh, that's why. Because I've done it backwards. Silly me, getting too hot in here. I wish our summer was over. Okay, suitably overdone. So you can use that to create your own vibrato as well. Obviously you need to choose and define how much of that and that can go across a whole range of guitar, dulcimer, any of those sorts of things. probably the main range of polyphonic sounds. There are tons and tons of little variations, which, as you've seen, by changing one thing, we can alter how something behaves. But they're mere details, which you work out as you go when you're building your sound. That I don't love the vibrato in. But now we're pulling it out of tune a little bit overall, and then more of an in-between type thing, maybe a David Lynch kind of thing, but it's a polyphonic sound, and we've built that to hear how if we just play it without the stretch, it's a bit, yeah, whatever. As soon as we stretch that string, get to have the pitch bend coming off after touch or whatever, it's suddenly much nicer. Now, very tempting at that point, if you've got another envelope, let's say we've got this fella here, and most people are going to make this decision, and it's kind of going to be a mistake. Global envelope, we'll assign that to pitch of our oscillator. Now, can you hear the mistake or the problem that we've developed? I'm not expecting you to answer me because I can't hear you, but I'm hoping that you've come up with, even though that's creating a bend, it's very predictable. It's very the same every single time. Really tempting to automate your movements, to go, I'll use an LFO or I'll use an automator to automate it. You can do it, but it is not going to give you the same result as if you actually do this in either real time, is obviously the nicest way of doing it, so the envelope curve there is the one that I feel. It's my feeling. See, I can go slow on that one, hard, and then back off on that one. Now, if you're not comfortable playing things, I don't love playing things a lot of the time either, then there's absolutely nothing to stop you from taking that thinking. So I can play with this and go, wow, that really works beautifully. But I don't think I can play that in real time. So I'll put my notes in, whether by playing them or mousing them in, and then I will take, like I might assign that, let's say I just assign that to a rotary knob. I might say, okay, I've played my notes in, now I'm going to go automate this fellow. Do it to feel low. Don't just rely on LFOs or a formula, say I'll do it once and copy it everywhere, because then suddenly you're going to start to sound synthy again, and you're undoing the sense of this music being unique and telling a story. That's why when your ma, hopefully when she told you stories, her tone of voice changed as the story changed. You as a musician are telling a story, so allow your tones and the way that they are modulated to change over time to suit what the story is. That's the most of it really with polyphonic sounds. Look for what's this got to do. This is a softer sound, so envelope attacks are slower. As soon as we want that to be a more percussive sound, then we're going to tighten those envelopes up. So sound built to what it's got to do, or your musical line comes as a result of the sound being that. Either way, it's the story of what you're doing. EQ, very much your friend in these, to pick out the bits in the middle. To pick in the middle, because that's what your polyphonic sounds are largely doing. They're playing in the middle. They're not playing hi-hats. Sorry, hi-hats. Up here, they're not playing, which one? That one. They're not playing bass lines. They're filling the middle. And if you've got nothing in the middle, your track is going to sound awfully hollow, which means you're going to be tempted to turn the bass up. You're going to do this kind of thing to your mix, going, my mix sounds hollow, obviously I need more bass. No, it's entirely probable that you need less bass and more middle. It's also entirely probable that you need less treble and a bit more something in the middle. A mix with this profile will tend to sound emotionally better than a mix with this profile. Now I know this all belongs in mixing, but because we're talking about polyphonic instruments and generally they belong in the middle of an arrangement, not talking about how you're going to mix them is probably a bit of a failing. Besides, if I do one on mixing and show you all this stuff, you've probably forgotten about it by then anyway and gone back to trying to make your mixes sound like this and wondering why they kind of don't work out. Remember, in the good old days of AM radio, which is the heyday of when rock was really vital, your mixes sounded more like that. Because AM radio wasn't giving you anything much above here. Anything sort of 5 to 8, you just weren't hearing it, it was rolled right off. The loudest part of your speaker was somewhere here. That's that sort of papery sound. You might have hated it, but it's still wonderful for clarity. And AM somehow managed to sound really thick around the middle. Probably in part because we didn't have too much of this. Those mixes still work. I can take any modern mix, apply that kind of curve to it, and it still works. I could take anything and do the complete opposite to it, and it's not long before that actually starts to fall to pieces. You might go, oh, it's really boomy, but every piece sounds the same. How are you going to stand out as unique when you've invested in nothing but the bits that sound exactly the same as everybody else? That mix is the same as what everybody else is trying to do. Don't do it. Put a lot of emphasis on what you're doing here in the middle, which are your polyphonic sounds. So I will put a lot of time and energy into doing these little performance tricks that make for really grabbing sounds in the middle there, and what I'm doing in the bass kind of comes afterwards. I know it's the opposite of what you're all doing, but a lot of us are struggling to get seen and heard, but it's because we're tending to chop our uniqueness out. So the way that I decide to create sounds is going to end up being unique to me. The way you end up deciding to create your sounds and your notes and everything will be unique to you, and that's in this range here. Make that your priority, so your polyphonic sounds are actually where you win. Okay, that's an awful lot, more than you expected, maybe different from what you expected, but if you have a think on it, it's going to change your ball game. Thank you very much.